The ancient church bells of St. Bartholomew's had just finished chiming 3 o'clock when Miss Jane Marple settled herself more comfortably in her wicker chair beneath the spreading chestnut tree. From this vantage point on the edge of the village green, she commanded an excellent view of the annual summer fete, that most cherished of English traditions which brought together the residents of Little Wickham in a delightful tableau of community spirit and barely concealed social intrigue. The afternoon sun cast a golden benediction over the scene, illuminating the colourful bunting that fluttered between the ancient elms and the cheerful chaos of stalls, selling everything from Mrs. Henderson's prize-winning preserves to hand-knitted tea-cosies of dubious practical value, but undeniable good intention. Children wove between the adults with the purposeful energy of small conspirators, their faces sticky with toffee apples and their pockets jingling with pennies earmarked for the coconut shy. Miss Marple's knitting lay temporarily forgotten in her lap as she observed the familiar cast of village characters going about their appointed roles in this annual drama. There was Colonel Bantry, resplendent in his blazer and regimental tie, holding forth near the beer tent about the declining standards of military discipline among the younger generation. Mrs. Dolly Bantry fluttered nearby, her attention divided between her husband's pronouncements and the strategic placement of the prize roses she had contributed to the flower arranging competition. Young Dr. Haydock moved through the crowd with the easy confidence of a man secure in his professional standing, pausing to exchange pleasantries while keeping a physician's eye on the more elderly participants who might succumb to the afternoon heat. But it was the figure in the simple grey habit who had captured Miss Marple's most careful attention. Sister Mary Clements, as she had been introduced by the vicar that morning, stood somewhat apart from the main festivities near the white elephant stall, her pale hands folded serenely before her as she watched the proceedings with an expression of profound, almost childlike bewilderment. The nun had arrived in Little Wickham only 3 days prior, seeking temporary sanctuary at the vicarage while recovering from what Reverend Clement had delicately described as a period of spiritual and physical exhaustion. She claimed to belong to the Sisters of Divine Mercy from a contemplative order near Gloucester, though when Mrs. Bantry had mentioned her own familiarity with several religious houses in that area, Sister Mary Clements had grown quite pale and quickly excused herself to attend to her prayers. Miss Marple had made several small observations about their mysterious visitor that had lodged themselves in her mind like burrs caught in wool. The nun's habit, while clean and properly worn, showed signs of hasty alteration. The hem had been let down recently, leaving a faint line visible in certain lights. Her hands, though appropriately soft for a woman of religious vocation, bore no trace of the small calluses one might expect from years of manual labor in convent gardens or kitchens. Most curious of all, when young Tommy Fletcher had accidentally knocked over a display of jam jars with a tremendous crash, Sister Mary Clements had not merely startled. She had thrown herself behind the nearest stall with the reflexive speed of someone accustomed to taking cover from more than falling preserves. Such a peaceful scene, isn't it, Miss Marple? The voice belonged to Mrs. Price Ridley, the village's most accomplished gossip, who had materialized beside Miss Marple's chair with the silent efficiency of a well-practiced eavesdropper. Though I must say, there's something rather odd about our visiting nun, don't you think? Miss Marple's needles resumed their gentle clicking as she considered her response. In what way, Mrs. Price Ridley? Well, the woman lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. I was speaking with her earlier about the lovely weather we've been having, and she asked me what month it was. What month? Can you imagine? When I told her it was August, she looked at me as if I'd spoken in a foreign tongue. Then she asked, and this is the truly peculiar part, she asked me what year it was. The knitting needles paused for just a moment before resuming their rhythm. How very strange, Miss Marple murmured. Perhaps the poor dear has been unwell. That's what I thought initially, Mrs. Price Ridley continued, warming to her theme. But then I noticed something else. When the vicar introduced her to the Hendersons, she couldn't remember her own name for a moment. Just stood there with her mouth open like a fish, until finally she said, "Sister Mary Clements," as if she were reading it off a card. Miss Marple followed Mrs. Price Ridley's gaze to where the nun now stood near the bookstall, her head tilted at an angle that suggested intense concentration as she studied the spine of what appeared to be a children's primer. As they watched, she picked up the book and opened it to the first page, her lips moving silently as if sounding out the words. "Perhaps," Miss Marple suggested gently, "she has suffered some form of memory loss. Such things are not unknown, particularly following periods of great stress or illness." Before Mrs. Price Ridley could respond, their attention was drawn to a commotion near the tea tent. Dr. Haydock had approached Sister Mary Clements with his usual professional bonhomie, offering her a cup of tea and a slice of Mrs. Henderson's famous Victoria sponge. The nun had accepted gratefully, but when she lifted the teacup to her lips, her hands began to tremble so violently that the cup rattled against the saucer like castanets. "My dear sister," Dr. Haydock said with immediate concern, "you seem quite distressed. Perhaps you should sit down." The nun's response was barely audible from Miss Marple's position, but the effect on Dr. Haydock was immediate and startling. His face went pale, and he glanced quickly around the fete as if suddenly seeing it through different eyes. He leaned closer to Sister Mary Clements, speaking in urgent, hushed tones. Miss Marple rose from her chair with the measured grace of someone who had learned that in matters of human drama, the most revealing moments often occurred in the spaces between official conversations. She made her way toward the tea tent with the unhurried pace of someone merely seeking refreshment, her keen eyes catching fragments of the exchange. "Don't remember anything before yesterday morning," the nun was saying, her voice carrying a note of desperate confusion. "I woke up in a field outside the village wearing these clothes, but I don't know how I got there. I don't know who I am." Dr. Haydock's professional demeanor had shifted into something more urgent. "Sister, this is quite serious. We should contact the authorities immediately. Memory loss of this severity—" "No!" The word escaped the nun with such force that several nearby villagers turned to stare. She quickly lowered her voice, but Miss Marple could see the fear that had transformed her pale features. "Please, no authorities. I have a feeling that would be very dangerous, for reasons I cannot explain." It was at that precise moment, as the afternoon sun reached its golden zenith and the village fete hummed with the contented buzz of English summer tradition, that the peaceful scene was shattered by a scream of pure terror from the direction of St. Bartholomew's Church. Mrs. Henderson came running from the churchyard, her face white with shock, her carefully arranged hair now wild with panic. "Help!" she cried, her voice carrying across the green with the clarity of absolute horror. "Someone help! There's been a terrible accident, or worse, there's a body in the crypt." The effect on the fete was immediate and electric. Conversations ceased mid-sentence, children stopped their games, and every face turned toward the church with the collective intake of breath that accompanies the moment when ordinary life reveals its capacity for extraordinary darkness. But Miss Marple, even as she moved with the crowd toward the source of the disturbance, found her attention caught by something else entirely. Sister Mary Clements had not joined the exodus toward the church. Instead, she stood frozen beside the tea tent, her face a mask of terror so profound that it seemed to transcend even the immediate horror of Mrs. Henderson's discovery. And in that moment of crystalline observation, Miss Marple noticed one final, crucial detail that would prove significant in the days to come. Clutched in the nun's trembling hand, partially concealed by the folds of her habit, was a small brass key, old, ornate, and bearing the unmistakable patina of something that had recently been disturbed from a very old hiding place indeed. As the crowd surged toward St. Bartholomew's and the mystery that awaited them in its ancient crypt, Miss Marple found herself wondering whether the nun who could not remember her own name might, in fact, be the only person in Little Wickham who knew exactly why someone had chosen this particular afternoon to commit murder. The summer fete at St. Bartholomew's had begun as a celebration of community and tradition. It would end as something far more sinister. The opening act in a drama where forgotten identities and buried secrets would prove that sometimes the most dangerous mysteries were those that had been deliberately erased from memory. The crowd that surged toward St. Bartholomew's moved with a peculiar mixture of horror and fascination that transforms ordinary villagers into a collective organism hungry for details of the extraordinary. Miss Marple found herself carried along by this human tide, though she managed to position herself where observation would be most fruitful and where the conversations of others might reveal as much as the official investigation. Mrs. Henderson, still trembling from her discovery, was being ministered to by Mrs. Bantry with sal volatile and gentle reassurances, while Colonel Bantry had assumed command of the situation with military precision. "Stand back, everyone," he ordered in his parade ground voice. "This is clearly a matter for the authorities. Dr. Haydock, perhaps you would examine the situation below." Dr. Haydock nodded grimly, his earlier professional bonhomie replaced by the grave demeanor his medical training demanded in such circumstances. He descended the worn stone steps that led to the church's ancient crypt, his medical bag in hand, while the heavy oak door, normally secured with an iron lock, stood ominously ajar. Miss Marple noted with particular interest that the lock showed no signs of forcing, suggesting that whoever had gained entry possessed either considerable skill or the proper key. The thought of keys brought her attention back to the absent figure of Sister Mary Clements, and she cast a discreet glance toward the tea tent area where she had last observed their mysterious visitor. The nun was no longer visible among the stragglers at the fete. "How exactly did you come to make this discovery, Mrs. Henderson?" Reverend Clement asked gently, his usual serene composure considerably shaken by this violation of his sacred ground. Mrs. Henderson dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, gathering herself to recount the terrible moment. "I was arranging the flowers for tomorrow's service," she explained, her voice quavering with remembered shock. "The crypt has such lovely cool air for keeping the arrangements fresh overnight. I've been doing the church flowers for 23 years, after all, and I had the key from the vestry as always. But when I reached the door, it stood open already." She paused, pressing the handkerchief to her lips before continuing. "I called out, thinking perhaps you had gone down earlier, Vicar, but there was no answer. The electric light that's usually left burning had been extinguished, so I used my torch. That's when I saw him. Poor Mr. Blackwood lying among the old tombs. Quite clearly dead, I'm afraid, with a terrible wound to his head." A collective gasp rippled through the assembled villagers. Silas Blackwood, the village's wealthy but thoroughly disagreeable newcomer who had purchased the old manor house 5 years prior and proceeded to antagonize half the village with his litigious nature and general disdain for local customs. The incongruity of finding such a man, who never attended church services, dead in the sacred crypt was almost as shocking as the fact of his murder. Dr. Haydock's voice echoed up from below, professional and controlled. "I'm afraid Mrs. Henderson is quite correct. Mr. Blackwood has indeed met with violence, a severe blow to the head. This is most definitely a matter for the police." Young Tommy Fletcher, the baker's son, had been hovering near the church entrance with the barely contained excitement of someone possessing important information. As the crowd began to murmur and speculate, he approached Miss Marple with the confidence that she, unlike the adults who might scold him for speaking out of turn, would listen to what he had observed. "Miss Marple," he said in a stage whisper that carried farther than intended, "I saw something peculiar this morning, early like. I was out delivering bread before the fete, and I spotted that nun, Sister Mary, what's her name, coming out of the church around 6 o'clock. She looked right strange, like she'd seen something terrible, and she was carrying something wrapped in a cloth." Miss Marple's knitting needles, which had resumed their gentle rhythm, paused almost imperceptibly. "How very observant of you, Tommy. Could you see what she was carrying?" "Something long and thin it was, miss, like a candlestick or perhaps a poker, and the cloth had dark stains on it. Could have been dirt, but... He lowered his voice to an even more theatrical whisper. Could have been blood, couldn't it? Before Miss Marple could respond, the sound of a motor car announced the arrival of Inspector Slack from the county police headquarters. She had encountered the inspector on previous occasions and had formed the opinion that while he was undoubtedly conscientious, he possessed the unfortunate tendency to seize upon the most obvious explanation and pursue it with terrier-like determination. Inspector Slack strode into the church with his notebook already in hand, his sharp eyes taking in the scene with professional efficiency. "Right then," he announced to the assembled crowd. "I'll need statements from everyone present. No one leaves until I've had a word. Dr. Haydock, what can you tell me about the deceased?" "Silas Blackwood, aged approximately 60, Dr. Haydock reported as he emerged from the crypt. "Single, blow to the head with a heavy object. Something with a smooth, rounded surface. Death occurred within the last few hours, certainly during the time of your fate." Inspector Slack's gaze swept the crowd and settled briefly on the space where Sister Mary Clements should have been standing. And where might our visiting nun have got to? The question hung in the air with uncomfortable weight. Reverend Clement cleared his throat nervously. Sister Mary Clements was feeling unwell earlier. My wife took her back to the vicarage for a glass of water and a rest. "Did she indeed?" Inspector Slack murmured, making a note. "We'll want to speak with her directly. Now then, who had access to the church crypt?" Mr. Pottle, the verger, stepped forward with the offended dignity of someone whose domain had been violated. "The crypt keys are kept in the vestry safe, Inspector. Only myself, the Reverend, and Mrs. Henderson, for her flower arranging, have regular access. Though..." He hesitated, glancing around nervously. "Though what, Mr. Pottle?" "Well, sir, Amos Reed, that's our sexton. He mentioned last week that someone had been asking questions about the old chest down in the crypt. Said he'd received a note inquiring about historical church artifacts. Thought it was from some university researcher, but when I asked to see the note, he couldn't seem to locate it." Miss Marple absorbed this information with the careful attention she gave to all potentially significant details. The mention of the old chest brought her thoughts immediately back to the brass key she had observed in Sister Mary Clements's possession. The timing seemed remarkably coincidental, a mysterious nun with amnesia carrying an antique key, arriving just days before someone showed interest in the church's historical artifacts. Inspector Slack had organized his constables to take statements, but Miss Marple found herself drawn back toward the crypt entrance. "Inspector," she said in her gentle voice that nevertheless carried clearly, "might I have just a moment to look at this chest that's been mentioned? I do so enjoy old church artifacts." Slack looked as if she had asked to borrow his handcuffs, but Dr. Haydock interceded. "I think that would be quite safe, Inspector. Miss Marple has a remarkable eye for detail." The crypt was indeed cooler, carrying the ancient smell of stone that had learned patience through centuries. Miss Marple's eyes went immediately to the iron-bound chest that sat against the far wall, noting that it had been moved recently. The dust patterns on the floor showed clear evidence of disturbance. The chest itself was a modest piece of church furniture, oak dark with age and iron straps that spoke of medieval craftsmanship. But it was the keyhole that captured her attention entirely. Someone had taken considerable care to work the iron into a decorative pattern around the lock, 3 overlapping leaves with the central one longer than the others, creating a design that was both functional and beautiful. The pattern was identical to the brass key she had observed in Sister Mary Clements's trembling hand. "How very interesting," Miss Marple murmured to herself, running her fingers lightly over the chest's surface. The dust told its own story. Something had been removed from the top recently, leaving a clean rectangle in the accumulated grime. Something long and narrow, perhaps the size of a candlestick or ceremonial object. When they emerged from the crypt, the village had arranged itself into the familiar patterns of crisis. Tight clusters of conversation, meaningful glances, and the electric atmosphere of shared speculation. Inspector Slack was efficiently organizing his investigation, but Miss Marple found herself increasingly concerned about the absence of Sister Mary Clemence. "Inspector," she said quietly, "I do think it might be wise to speak with our visiting nun as soon as possible. There are certain inconsistencies in her situation that might prove relevant to your investigation." But even as she spoke, Griselda Clement came hurrying across the churchyard, her face flushed with exertion and worry. "Inspector Slack," she called out, "I'm terribly sorry, but Sister Mary Clemence, she's gone. I left her resting in the parlor with a glass of water, but when I returned just now, the room was empty. She seems to have taken nothing with her except—" Griselda hesitated, clearly reluctant to voice her suspicions. "Except what, Mrs. Clement?" "Except my husband's spare cassock from the hall cupboard, and a small sum of money from the poor box in the kitchen. I do hope there's some innocent explanation, but given the circumstances—" Inspector Slack's expression hardened with the satisfaction of a man whose suspicions had been confirmed. "Right then. We'll want that description circulated immediately. A nun in stolen clerical garb shouldn't be too difficult to spot." But Miss Marple, watching the inspector's obvious pleasure in having identified his prime suspect, found herself remembering the terror in Sister Mary Clemence's eyes when Mrs. Henderson had screamed. It had not been the fear of discovery, she thought, but something deeper. The fear of recognition, perhaps, or of memories that were fighting to surface, despite every effort to keep them buried. The brass key, the mysterious chest, the convenient amnesia, and now a hasty flight. All the pieces seemed to point in one obvious direction. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that when a puzzle appeared too neat, too perfectly arranged, it was often because someone had taken considerable care to make it appear that way. As the shadows lengthened across the village green and the abandoned stalls of the summer fete stood like empty stage sets, Miss Marple found herself wondering not whether Sister Mary Clemence was guilty of murder, but whether she might, in fact, be the next intended victim in a game whose rules only the true killer understood. The mystery of the nun who had forgotten her own name had become something far more complex. A deadly puzzle where memory itself had become both weapon and shield, and where the truth lay hidden beneath layers of carefully constructed deception. The crowd that had surged toward St. Bartholomew's began to disperse as Inspector Slack established his methodical control over the crime scene. But the electric atmosphere of shared shock and speculation continued to crackle through Little Wickham like summer lightning. Miss Marple found herself positioned near the church gate, where conversations naturally converged, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm as she absorbed the fragments of information that drifted around her like leaves on an autumn wind. Inspector Slack emerged from the crypt with the grim satisfaction of a man whose initial assumptions were being confirmed by evidence. His constables had already begun the systematic process of taking statements, but Miss Marple observed that the inspector's attention seemed focused primarily on gathering details that would support his theory of Sister Mary Clemence as the obvious culprit, rather than exploring alternative possibilities. Dr. Haydock approached the inspector with his medical bag still in hand, his professional demeanor carrying the weight of additional discoveries. "Inspector, I've completed my preliminary examination of Mr. Blackwood, and there are several points you should be aware of." Miss Marple positioned herself where she might overhear this crucial exchange, her needles clicking with the measured patience of someone accustomed to gathering information through careful listening rather than direct inquiry. "The fatal blow was indeed delivered by a heavy, rounded object," Dr. Haydock continued, "but the angle and force suggest an attacker of considerably shorter stature than average, perhaps 5 feet 2 or 3 inches in height. Moreover, there are defensive wounds on the deceased's hands and forearms, indicating he fought with his assailant." Inspector Slack nodded with obvious satisfaction. "That matches our missing nun perfectly, Doctor. Small woman, plenty of motive if she was after whatever was in that chest." But Dr. Haydock's expression remained troubled. "That's precisely what concerns me, Inspector. If there was indeed a physical struggle, as the evidence suggests, I would expect to see corresponding injuries on the attacker. Scratches, bruises, torn clothing. When I observed Sister Mary Clemence at the fête, she showed no such signs of recent violence. This observation aligned perfectly with Miss Marple's own careful study of their mysterious visitor. The woman had certainly been distressed, but she had displayed no physical evidence of having recently engaged in mortal combat with a man of Silas Blackwood's considerable size and notorious temper. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Pottle, the verger, whose usual dignity was considerably ruffled by the violation of his sacred domain. "Inspector Slack," he called out with barely controlled agitation, "I must report something most disturbing. The ceremonial verger's mace is missing from the vestry." The inspector's attention sharpened immediately. "Describe this mace, Mr. Pottle." "Iron head on a stout wooden shaft, Inspector. Medieval craftsmanship, quite heavy, with a rounded ceremonial head. We keep it polished for special occasions, though it's rarely used in modern services." Mr. Pottle's voice carried the particular anguish of a man whose carefully maintained order had been disrupted. "I saw it in its proper place on Friday evening when I locked the vestry, but this morning it was gone." Dr. Haydock exchanged a significant glance with Inspector Slack. "That would match perfectly with the wound characteristics I observed, Inspector. A ceremonial mace would deliver exactly the sort of blow that killed Mr. Blackwood." Miss Marple absorbed this information while observing the reactions of the villagers who had gathered close enough to overhear. The missing mace provided a concrete murder weapon, but it also raised questions about how Sister Mary Clemence might have known of its existence or gained access to the locked vestry. Mrs. Price Ridley, who had been hovering at the edge of the official conversations with her usual talent for gathering intelligence, approached Miss Marple with barely contained excitement. "Did you hear about the mace, Miss Marple? Though I must say, I had my suspicions about that nun from the very beginning." Mrs. Bantry tried to engage her in conversation about convent life, and the poor woman couldn't answer the simplest questions about religious routine. "What sort of questions?" Miss Marple inquired with gentle interest. "Basic things. What time the sisters rose for morning prayers, how many years she had been in the order, whether she had taken final vows." She just stared as if Mrs. Bantry was speaking in a foreign tongue, then excused herself quite abruptly. This detail struck Miss Marple as particularly significant, though not necessarily in the way Mrs. Price Ridley intended. A woman genuinely suffering from amnesia might indeed struggle with such specific questions, while someone deliberately impersonating a nun would likely have prepared better answers for such obvious inquiries. The sound of approaching footsteps announced the arrival of Amos Reed, the elderly sexton, whose weathered face bore the expression of a man carrying troubling news. "Beggin' pardon, Inspector," he said, removing his cap with old-fashioned courtesy. "But I thought you should know about the note I mentioned earlier." Inspector Slack looked up from his notebook with sharp attention. "What note would that be, Mr. Reed?" 3 days ago, sir, someone slipped a note under the vestry door asking about access for a researcher to examine historic furnishings of the crypt. No name signed, but the paper had a watermark. Looked like a swan to me. When I went back to show it to Mr. Pottle after morning service, it had vanished from where I'd placed it." Miss Marple's needles paused almost imperceptibly. A swan watermark suggested hotel stationery, and the timing of the inquiry, just days before Sister Mary Clemence's arrival, seemed remarkably coincidental. "The envelope wasn't posted," Amos continued. "No stamp on it. Someone walked it there from close by, someone who knew how to reach the vestry unobserved. This information painted a picture of careful planning that seemed inconsistent with the image of a confused, amnesiac nun stumbling into criminal behavior." Miss Marple found herself increasingly convinced that the obvious explanation was precisely what someone wanted them to believe. Young Tommy Fletcher, who had been hovering nearby with the barely contained excitement of someone possessing important information, finally approached Inspector Slack with his earlier observation. "Inspector, sir, I saw that nun coming out of the church early this morning around 6 o'clock. She looked terrible strange, like she'd seen something awful, and she was carrying something wrapped in cloth." "What sort of something?" Inspector Slack demanded. "Long and thin it was, sir. Could have been a candlestick, or maybe that mace Mr. Pottle mentioned. And the cloth had dark stains. Could have been dirt, but could have been blood too." Inspector Slack made careful notes, his satisfaction with the developing case evident in his increasingly confident demeanor. But Miss Marple, observing Tommy's earnest young face, found herself wondering whether a 6-year-old boy's interpretation of what he had seen might be colored by the dramatic events that had followed. As the afternoon shadows lengthened and the abandoned stalls of the summer fete stood like empty stage sets, Miss Marple made her way toward the vicarage, where Griselda Clement met her at the garden gate with obvious relief. "Jane, thank goodness you're here," Griselda said, her usual cheerful demeanor strained by the day's events. "I've been thinking about our conversation with Sister Mary Clements, and there's something that's been troubling me." They walked together through the vicarage garden, where the peaceful domesticity of herb borders and rose beds seemed incongruous with the violent drama unfolding around them. "When I brought her inside for that glass of water," Griselda continued, "she kept staring at the family photographs on the mantelpiece. Not with the polite interest of a visitor, but with the most intense concentration, as if she were trying to remember something important. When I asked if she recognized anyone, she became quite agitated and said something about bells, not church bells, but handbells, and the smell of beeswax." Miss Marple absorbed this information with careful attention. Handbells and beeswax suggested not a convent, but perhaps a domestic setting where such items might be found. A well-appointed household, possibly, where bells summoned servants and furniture was maintained with proper care. "There's something else, Jane," Griselda added, lowering her voice as they approached the vicarage door. "After she disappeared, I found this tucked behind the cushion of the chair where she'd been sitting." She handed Miss Marple a small piece of brown paper, grease-spotted and torn from what appeared to be a grocer's bag. On it, barely visible, was a faint violet stamp bearing the image of a swan, and the words, "The White Swan, Gloucester Road." Miss Marple examined the paper with the careful attention she gave to all potentially significant clues. The connection between this hotel paper and the mysterious note with its swan watermark seemed too specific to be coincidental. "Griselda, my dear," she said gently, "I believe we may be dealing with something considerably more complex than Inspector Slack realizes. This Sister Mary Clements, whoever she truly is, may be less a perpetrator than a victim of circumstances she cannot even remember." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Haydock, whose medical bag and grave expression suggested he carried additional troubling news. "Miss Marple, Mrs. Clement," he acknowledged with a brief nod. "I don't suppose you've heard anything from our missing nun. I've just had a rather disturbing conversation with Mrs. Larkin at Blackwood Manor, and I'm beginning to fear we may be dealing with something far more dangerous than a simple case of murder." Miss Marple invited the doctor to join them in the vicarage parlor, where the afternoon light filtering through lace curtains created an atmosphere of deceptive tranquility. Mrs. Larkin mentioned that Mr. Blackwood had been expecting someone today. Dr. Haydock continued. "He received a letter this morning, hand-delivered, no stamp, and he was quite pleased about it. Said it would put certain people where they belonged before the week was out. When he left for his appointment, he was carrying his walking stick, though Mrs. Larkin noticed that one of his collection was missing from the hall stand." "An appointment?" Miss Marple inquired. "He told Mrs. Larkin he was meeting someone where the stones don't speak and the air is cool." She assumed he meant the church crypt, given its reputation for being drafty and unpleasant. This revelation cast the morning's events in an entirely different light. If Silas Blackwood had arranged to meet someone in the crypt, his presence there was not accidental, but planned. The question remained whether Sister Mary Clements had been his intended meeting partner or an unexpected witness to something far more sinister. Miss Marple found herself facing a crucial decision. Inspector Slack was pursuing his investigation with the methodical efficiency of a man convinced he had identified his culprit, but the accumulating evidence suggested a puzzle far more complex than the obvious solution would indicate. The mysterious hotel connection, the carefully planned inquiry about the crypt, and the nun's genuine terror all pointed toward a truth that lay hidden beneath layers of deliberate deception. "Dr. Haydock," she said with quiet determination, "I believe we must find Sister Mary Clements before Inspector Slack does. Not to apprehend a criminal, but to protect what may be the only person who can eventually remember the truth about what really happened in that crypt." The doctor nodded gravely. "I've been thinking along similar lines myself, Miss Marple. There are too many inconsistencies in this case for comfort. If we are to prevent a miscarriage of justice, or possibly something worse, we must act quickly." As the evening shadows began to gather around Little Wickham, Miss Marple prepared to embark on what she increasingly suspected would be a race against time. The mystery of the nun who had forgotten her own name was about to reveal its first crucial secrets, and those secrets would prove far more dangerous than anyone in the village had yet imagined. The summer fete that had begun with such innocent celebration had become the opening act in a drama where memory itself had become both weapon and shield, and where the truth lay buried beneath the carefully constructed facade of obvious guilt. The decision to locate Sister Mary Clements before Inspector Slack could apprehend her required both discretion and urgency. Miss Marple recognized that any overt interference with the official investigation would invite unwelcome scrutiny. Yet the mounting inconsistencies in the case demanded immediate attention. As evening shadows began to gather around Little Wickham, she found herself formulating a careful strategy that would allow them to pursue their own inquiries while maintaining the appearance of helpful cooperation. The evening investigation begins. Dr. Haydock consulted his pocket watch with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to emergency calls. "My medical standing provides certain privileges that might prove useful in our search," he observed. "If Sister Mary Clements is genuinely suffering from amnesia, she would likely seek either medical attention or shelter, somewhere she instinctively felt safe." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her fingers smoothing the grease-stained hotel paper that Griselda had discovered. "This scrap from the White Swan on Gloucester Road may be our most promising lead. If she has some connection to that establishment, she might return there without conscious understanding of why it feels familiar." Their planning was interrupted by the sound of official footsteps on the garden path. Through the vicarage window, they observed Inspector Slack approaching with his constable, his expression carrying the determined satisfaction of a man confident in his theory of the case. "Good evening, Inspector," Griselda said as she admitted the policeman to the parlor. "I do hope you've made progress." Inspector Slack removed his hat with perfunctory courtesy, his sharp eyes surveying the domestic scene with professional suspicion. "I need to ask additional questions about your interactions with the suspect. We have reason to believe she may have revealed information about her intentions." Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm as she prepared to navigate this delicate interrogation. The inspector's questions focused primarily on gathering evidence to support his predetermined conclusion, but she noted with interest the details that emerged during his systematic inquiry. Village revelations and hidden motives. As Inspector Slack conducted his interviews in the village hall, Miss Marple positioned herself where she might observe both the official proceedings and the reactions of the gathered villagers. The murder had torn through the peaceful facade of Little Wickham, exposing long-simmering resentments and carefully concealed antagonisms. Mr. Perkins, the nervous postmaster, revealed that Silas Blackwood had been a thoroughly disagreeable neighbor who had antagonized half the village with various disputes. "There was that business with the ancient footpath he tried to fence off," Perkins stammered, polishing his spectacles anxiously. "Caused quite a stir with the Ramblers Association, and the dispute with Mrs. Tibbs over her prize goose that wandered onto his property?" He threatened to shoot it. More significantly, Mr. Finch, the local builder, recounted his bitter financial dispute with Blackwood. He refused to pay for the conservatory I built, claiming the foundations were unsound when it was his own penny-pinching that led to cheap materials. Finch declared, his powerful forearms tensing with remembered frustration. Miss Marple observed that despite Finch's obvious anger, his hands bore no fresh scratches or defensive wounds that would suggest recent violent struggle. Dr. Haydock's earlier observation about the absence of corresponding injuries on the attacker remained a crucial inconsistency in the obvious theory. The hotel connection. While Inspector Slack pursued his methodical but narrow investigation, Dr. Haydock made his discreet journey to the White Swan on Gloucester Road. His medical credentials provided the perfect cover for inquiries about a distressed woman who might have sought assistance. Upon his return, as twilight deepened over the village, he found Miss Marple in the vicarage parlor, sharing a quiet cup of tea with Griselda Clement. "No sign of her at present," he reported, settling into an armchair with evident fatigue. However, the hotel manager confirmed that a woman matching our nun's description checked in 3 days ago under the name Sister Agnes, not Sister Mary Clements. She paid in cash and claimed to be on a spiritual retreat before rejoining her religious order. Miss Marple's needles paused thoughtfully. Sister Agnes. Another borrowed identity, perhaps, chosen as carefully as Sister Mary Clements. The pattern suggests someone selecting names that sound appropriately religious, without requiring detailed knowledge of actual religious orders. The manager also mentioned that she seemed extremely agitated upon arrival. Dr. Haydock continued. She kept asking about local landmarks, as if trying to orient herself geographically. Most intriguingly, she carried a small, old-fashioned leather valise that she guarded very protectively. This detail resonated immediately with Miss Marple's earlier observation of the brass key. The combination of the protective behavior toward the valise and the antique key suggested items of particular significance, perhaps documents or objects that held the key to her true identity. Accumulating evidence and growing suspicions. As the evening progressed, Miss Marple found herself increasingly troubled by the convenient perfection of the evidence against Sister Mary Clements. Mr. Pottle's report of the missing ceremonial mace provided an obvious murder weapon, while Mrs. Larkin's mention of Blackwood's missing walking stick offered an alternative possibility. Both objects were capable of inflicting the fatal wound, yet both conveniently pointed toward different aspects of the case. 2 potential murder weapons, she mused aloud to Dr. Haydock, both missing, both capable of causing identical injuries, one from the church, suggesting religious connection, one from the victim's own home, suggesting personal vendetta. It's almost as if someone wished to provide multiple convenient explanations. Dr. Haydock leaned forward with growing understanding. "You're suggesting the killer deliberately created this confusion? That the abundance of evidence might itself be suspicious?" "Precisely," Miss Marple replied, her voice carrying the quiet conviction of long experience. "When someone truly wishes to conceal a crime, they eliminate evidence rather than creating an embarrassment of riches. The careful placement of clues, the convenient timing of observations, the perfect alignment of circumstances, all suggest a mind that understands how investigations proceed and wishes to direct them toward a predetermined conclusion. The deeper game. Revealed. As they sat in the peaceful vicarage parlor, the implications of this revelation settled around them like gathering dusk. The mystery was not simply about identifying a killer, but about understanding why someone had taken such elaborate care to frame an amnesiac woman whose very condition made her the perfect scapegoat. "The brass key she carries," Miss Marple continued, her thoughts crystallizing as she spoke, "the hotel connection, the carefully timed arrival in the village, even the convenient amnesia, all serve to create a suspect who appears guilty while being fundamentally unable to defend herself effectively." Dr. Haydock's expression grew grave as he grasped the full implications. "Then we're not just trying to prevent a wrongful arrest, we may be trying," To protect the next intended victim. Miss Marple nodded slowly, her knitting forgotten in her lap. Someone has invested considerable effort in creating this elaborate deception. Such investment suggests the stakes are far higher than a simple murder, no matter how unpleasant the victim. Our sister Mary Clements, or whoever she truly is, represents either a threat to someone's carefully laid plans or possesses knowledge that someone desperately needs to remain buried. The peaceful evening air carried the distant sound of Inspector Slack's continued investigations, but Miss Marple knew that the official inquiry was pursuing shadows, while the real danger remained hidden in plain sight. The game that had begun with the summer fete was revealing itself as something far more sophisticated and deadly than anyone in Little Wickham had yet imagined. As the church bells chimed 9 o'clock across the village green, Miss Marple realized that time was becoming their most precious commodity. Somewhere in the gathering darkness, the real killer was watching their careful investigation unfold, and the mysterious woman who could not remember her own name remained the key to preventing not just a miscarriage of justice, but quite possibly another death. The mystery of the nun who had forgotten her own name was transforming into something far more complex, a deadly puzzle where memory itself had become both weapon and shield, and where the truth lay hidden beneath layers of carefully constructed deception that reached far beyond the quiet boundaries of their English village. The realization that they were confronting a sophisticated conspiracy rather than a simple village murder transformed the evening's urgency from mere investigation to a race against time. Miss Marple found herself studying the peaceful domesticity of the vicarage parlor with new eyes, recognizing that even this sanctuary might not be immune to whatever malevolent forces had orchestrated the day's events. Dr. Haydock consulted his pocket watch with the methodical precision his medical training demanded. If Sister Mary Clements is indeed the intended victim rather than the perpetrator, then Inspector Slack's manhunt may be driving her directly toward whoever planned this elaborate deception. Miss Marple nodded gravely, her fingers tracing the edge of the hotel paper that had provided their first concrete connection. The question becomes whether she fled because fragments of memory are returning and she recognizes the danger, or whether she's acting purely on instinct without understanding the source of her terror. Their deliberations were interrupted by a soft tapping at the French doors leading to the garden. Young Tommy Fletcher appeared in the gathering dusk, his face bearing the particular excitement of someone carrying urgent intelligence. Griselda admitted him with the careful quiet of conspiracy, and he approached Miss Marple with barely contained urgency. "Miss Marple," he whispered, glancing toward the windows as if expecting eavesdroppers. "I've seen her, that nun everyone's searching for. She's taken shelter in the old mill by Wickham Stream, but she looks terrible frightened. When she spotted me approaching, she tried to hide behind the water wheel, but I told her I wouldn't inform the constables if she preferred I didn't." Dr. Haydock leaned forward with immediate professional concern. "Did she appear injured, Tommy, or suffering from illness?" "Not injured exactly, sir, but trembling something fierce. She kept glancing over her shoulder as if someone might be following, and she still had that cloth bundle I observed this morning, though it seemed different now, heavier, as if she'd wrapped additional items within it." Miss Marple absorbed this information with the careful attention she gave to all potentially significant details. The old mill provided excellent concealment, but it also represented a potential trap for anyone who wished to corner their quarry. The fact that Sister Mary Clements had remained within the immediate vicinity rather than seeking distant refuge suggested either that her confused state prevented clear reasoning or that she possessed compelling reasons to stay near Little Wickham. "Did she speak to you at all, Tommy?" Miss Marple inquired gently. "Anything that might illuminate her current state of mind?" The boy's face concentrated with the effort of precise recollection. "She asked what day it was, and when I told her Saturday, she got this peculiar expression and mentioned something about Sunday bells. Then she inquired whether I knew about the old Blackwood place before it got renovated all fancy-like. Seemed quite interested in that particular subject." This detail resonated with particular significance in Miss Marple's mind. The reference to Sunday bells suggested some connection to regular church observances, while her interest in the Blackwood property's history implied knowledge that predated recent changes. Both elements pointed toward memories struggling to surface, despite her apparent amnesia. The evening search. Before they could formulate their approach to the mill, Miss Marple suggested a preliminary investigation that might provide crucial context. Dr. Haydock, I believe we should first examine Blackwood Manor more thoroughly. Mrs. Larkin mentioned that he was expecting to put certain people where they belonged, and if someone is searching his residence tonight, we may discover what evidence he intended to use. Their careful approach to the manor revealed exactly what Miss Marple had suspected. Lights moved systematically through several windows, despite Mrs. Larkin's assertion that she had secured the house after discovering her employer's absence. The methodical nature of the search suggested someone familiar with the property's layout, conducting a thorough examination for specific items. Dr. Haydock observed the moving lights with growing understanding. Someone is indeed searching for whatever Blackwood intended to use against his enemies. The timing suggests they're racing against the possibility that his evidence might be discovered by authorities. They approached the manor with the careful stealth that the situation demanded, Miss Marple's years of village observation having taught her the art of moving unnoticed through familiar territory. The side entrance that Mrs. Larkin had mentioned stood slightly ajar, and they could hear voices from within, a man's authoritative tones and a woman's more hesitant responses. The papers must be here somewhere, the masculine voice declared with obvious frustration. He was too methodical to leave such things unsecured and too vindictive to destroy them without using them first. Perhaps he kept them at the bank, the woman suggested nervously, or with his solicitor in town. Don't be foolish, came the sharp reply. He wanted immediate access for his little revelation. Check the study again, behind the books, inside the desk drawers, anywhere a man might hide documents he intended to use for blackmail. Miss Marple exchanged a significant glance with Dr. Haydock. The conversation confirmed their theory about Blackwood's intentions while revealing that his killers were desperately seeking whatever evidence he had gathered. More importantly, it suggested that Sister Mary Clements might possess the very documents they were seeking. The discovery at the mill, armed with this crucial intelligence, they made their way to the old mill, where the gentle sound of Wickham Stream provided cover for their careful approach. The ancient structure stood silhouetted against the night sky, its water wheel motionless in the moonlight. Miss Marple noted that despite its abandoned appearance, someone had recently disturbed the vegetation around the entrance, creating a narrow path that spoke of regular use. Sister Mary Clements, Dr. Haydock called softly as they approached. We're here to help you. Miss Marple and Dr. Haydock from the village. Tommy Fletcher mentioned you might need assistance. The response came as a barely audible whisper from within the mill's shadowy interior. Please, don't let them find me. I don't understand why, but I know they mean me harm. Miss Marple moved forward with the gentle patience she had learned from decades of dealing with frightened and confused individuals. My dear, we believe you are indeed in danger, but not from us. May we enter so we might speak properly? The mill's interior carried the musty scent of long abandonment, but Miss Marple's experienced eyes quickly adjusted to the darkness. The woman who called herself Sister Mary Clements huddled near the old grinding stones, her gray habit torn and stained, her face bearing the haunted expression of someone fighting battles with memories that refused to surface clearly. I found these, she said, unwrapping her cloth bundle to reveal not the ceremonial mace that might have been expected, but an ornate silver candlestick and a collection of papers tied with faded ribbon. They were in that chest in the church crypt. The key I was carrying opened it, but I cannot comprehend why I possessed the key or what these documents signify. Dr. Haydock examined the papers by the light of his medical torch, his expression growing increasingly grave as he read. These appear to be legal documents, property deeds, birth certificates, and what looks like a will dated some 20 years past. Miss Marple studied the documents with her characteristic careful attention, noting the quality of the paper, the formal legal language, and most significantly, the names that appeared throughout. One name in particular captured her complete attention: Agnes Blackwood, listed as sole heir to a considerable estate. "My dear," she said with infinite gentleness, "these papers suggest that you are not Sister Mary Clements at all, but rather Agnes Blackwood, Silas Blackwood's niece and legal heir. Does this name carry any resonance for you?" The woman's reaction was immediate and profound. Her face went pale, and she pressed her hands to her temples as if fighting against tremendous internal pressure. "Agnes," she whispered, and then with growing strength and recognition, "Agnes Blackwood. Yes, that name feels true. But how could I have forgotten my own identity, and why was I dressed as a religious sister?" Dr. Haydock knelt beside her with professional concern. Memory loss following severe trauma is not uncommon. The crucial question is what happened to you and why someone invested such elaborate effort in disguising your identity and placing you at the scene of your uncle's murder. The net closes. As if summoned by their discovery, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the mill. These were not the measured steps of Inspector Slack's official search, but moved with the careful stealth of individuals who wished to remain unobserved and unidentified. Miss Marple gestured for absolute silence, her mind racing through the implications of their revelation. Agnes Blackwood, the missing heir, had been transformed into Sister Mary Clemence and positioned at the scene of her uncle's murder with convenient amnesia and perfectly incriminating evidence. Someone had orchestrated an elaborate scheme to eliminate both Blackwoods while ensuring that the legal heir would be convicted of the crime, leaving the considerable estate without a clear inheritor. The footsteps drew closer, and through the mill's broken windows, they could observe the beam of a torch moving systematically through the surrounding area. Someone had tracked them to their hiding place, and that someone clearly harbored no intention of allowing Agnes Blackwood to recover her memory or reclaim her inheritance. Miss Marple realized with crystalline clarity that they had walked directly into the final act of a carefully orchestrated drama. The real killer had been observing their investigation unfold, using their very efforts to locate Agnes as a means of completing the original plan. But as the footsteps approached the mill entrance, Miss Marple found herself smiling with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had finally grasped the complete pattern of the puzzle. The mystery of the nun who had forgotten her own name was about to reveal its deadliest secrets, and those secrets would prove that even the most sophisticated deception could not ultimately prevail against patient observation and the inexorable logic of human nature. The game that had begun with such deceptive innocence at the summer fete was approaching its climax, and Miss Marple prepared to demonstrate once again that justice possessed its own patient methods of triumph over even the most elaborate criminal conspiracy. The beam of torchlight that swept across the mill's broken windows carried with it the methodical confidence of someone who knew exactly where to search and what they expected to find. Miss Marple gestured silently for absolute stillness, her keen ears detecting not one but two sets of approaching footsteps, a discovery that confirmed her growing suspicion that the conspiracy extended beyond a single, desperate individual. The mill's ancient door creaked open with deliberate slowness, admitting two figures whose silhouettes resolved into familiar forms as they stepped into the moonlit interior. Mrs. Larkin moved with none of her usual deferential hesitation, her bearing transformed into something altogether more commanding and purposeful. Behind her, Mr. Pottle's ecclesiastical dignity had been replaced by nervous energy that spoke of a man operating well beyond his usual sphere of comfortable authority. "She must be here somewhere," Mrs. Larkin announced in a voice stripped of its customary servile inflection. "The boy was quite specific about the location, and our little Agnes has nowhere else to run with those documents." Miss Marple absorbed this transformation with the satisfaction of seeing long-held suspicions confirmed. The housekeeper's metamorphosis from grieving servant to confident conspirator explained both the systematic search of Blackwood Manor and the intimate knowledge of the victim's habits that had made the morning's crime possible. Mr. Pottle's torch swept the mill's interior with ecclesiastical thoroughness, his usual pompous certainty replaced by barely controlled anxiety. The candlestick must be recovered immediately, he insisted, his voice carrying the particular strain of someone whose carefully maintained reputation hung in the balance. If the authorities examine it too closely, they might discover— "They will discover nothing if we complete this business properly," Mrs. Larkin interrupted with crisp authority. Agnes Blackwood was always too trusting for her own good, even as a child. She won't have anticipated that her uncle's loyal housekeeper might have developed rather different loyalties over the years. Dr. Haydock positioned himself protectively in front of Agnes, whose face had gone pale with the shock of recognition. Miss Marple observed the young woman's reaction with careful attention, noting how fragments of suppressed memory were surfacing with painful clarity as she confronted the people who had systematically destroyed her life. Mrs. Larkin was more than just Uncle Silas's housekeeper. Agnes whispered barely audibly, her voice trembling with recovered understanding. She was his companion. He promised to marry her and include her in his will, but when I returned from my travels abroad, he changed his mind about both arrangements. This revelation provided the crucial motive that had been lurking beneath the surface of the obvious theories. Mrs. Larkin had not merely been a faithful servant, but a woman whose expectations of inheritance and social elevation had been shattered by Agnes's legitimate claim to the estate. The elaborate scheme to frame Agnes for her uncle's murder would have eliminated both obstacles to Mrs. Larkin's ambitions in a single, carefully orchestrated crime. Miss Marple's fingers worked quietly at the base of the silver candlestick while the conspirators continued their systematic search of the mill's shadowy recesses. The ornate piece had caught her attention, not merely for its obvious value, but for the subtle inconsistencies in its construction that suggested hidden purposes. Her patient manipulation revealed what she had suspected. The base unscrewed to reveal a narrow compartment that had recently held more than decorative weight. The documents Agnes discovered in the church chest, she murmured to Dr. Haydock with barely audible precision, were not the only items of significance hidden in that base. Someone has been using this candlestick as a repository for more than silver polish. As if summoned by her observation, Mrs. Larkin's attention fixed on their location with predatory intensity. "Agnes, my dear," she called with mock maternal concern, "there's no point in prolonging this unpleasant business. You have something that belongs to me, and I have every intention of reclaiming it." Mr. Pottle moved deeper into the mill, his torch beam probing the shadows with increasing desperation. "The ceremonial mace was returned to its proper place," he muttered with the particular anxiety of someone whose carefully maintained lies were beginning to unravel. "I saw to that personally after the morning's regrettable necessity." Miss Marple filed this crucial admission with the growing collection of inconsistencies that painted a picture far more complex than Inspector Slack's straightforward theory. If Pottle had returned the mace to the vestry, then its subsequent disappearance pointed toward additional players in the conspiracy. Individuals who had taken considerable care to ensure that the evidence would point inexorably toward Agnes. The sound of approaching voices from outside the mill announced the arrival of reinforcements, though whether these represented salvation or additional danger remained to be determined. Tommy Fletcher's young voice carried clearly across the night air, followed by the measured tones of Inspector Slack and his constables responding to the carefully orchestrated summons that Miss Marple had arranged through her network of village allies. "The police, Mrs. Larkin," Miss Marple announced with gentle satisfaction as she rose from her concealment. "I believe you will find that your elaborate deception has been rather thoroughly documented by individuals other than yourselves." Mrs. Larkin's confident demeanor wavered for the first time as she realized that their carefully laid trap had somehow been transformed into a snare for themselves. The conspiracy that had required months of preparation and the coordination of multiple participants was collapsing under the weight of its own complexity. But Miss Marple recognized that the most crucial revelations were yet to come. As Inspector Slack's authoritative voice echoed from the mill's entrance and his constables moved to secure the scene, she prepared to demonstrate once again that the most sophisticated criminal schemes invariably contained the seeds of their own destruction. The mystery of the nun who had forgotten her own name had revealed its central deception, but the full scope of the conspiracy and the identity of its remaining architects would require one final application of the patient logic that governed all human behavior, no matter how cleverly disguised, beneath layers of misdirection and carefully constructed lies. The water wheel of the old mill continued its ancient rhythm, grinding away the last vestiges of a deception that had begun with such meticulous planning, but would end with the inexorable triumph of truth over even the most elaborate criminal artistry. Inspector Slack's entrance into the mill carried with it the methodical authority of a man who had learned to approach complex situations with systematic precision. Though Miss Marple observed that his confident demeanor might soon encounter revelations that would challenge his initial assumptions about the case. His constables moved with practiced efficiency, their torches casting intersecting beams across the ancient timbers and revealing the tableau within, Mrs. Larkin's transformed bearing, Mr. Pottle's obvious distress, and the trembling figure of the woman he had been pursuing as a murderous nun. "Sister Mary Clements," Inspector Slack announced with grim satisfaction, "you've led us quite a chase, but I believe we can now bring this matter to its proper conclusion." Miss Marple stepped forward with the gentle authority that had served her well in previous encounters with hasty official determinations. "Inspector, I fear you may find the situation considerably more complex than your initial theory suggested. The woman you seek to arrest is not Sister Mary Clements at all, but Agnes Blackwood, the victim's niece and rightful heir to his estate." The inspector's confident expression wavered as he absorbed this unexpected revelation, his sharp eyes moving from Agnes to the scattered documents, then to the ornate silver candlestick that Dr. Haydock held with obvious significance. Mrs. Larkin's facade of servile cooperation had dissolved entirely, replaced by the cold calculation of someone whose carefully orchestrated plans were collapsing around her. Yet even in defeat, she retained the commanding presence that had enabled her to manipulate events with such devastating effectiveness. "Inspector," she said with renewed authority, attempting to regain control of the narrative, "I'm afraid you're being deceived by a very clever murderer. This woman may claim to be Agnes Blackwood, but I can assure you that the real Agnes died in a carriage accident in Switzerland 3 years ago." Miss Marple noted the specific nature of this lie with particular interest. The mention of Switzerland and a carriage accident suggested not improvised deception, but carefully prepared backstory. Evidence of planning that extended far beyond the immediate crime. Dr. Haydock stepped forward with the documents they had discovered in the church chest, his medical training lending authority to his careful presentation of evidence. "These papers establish Miss Blackwood's identity beyond question, Inspector. Birth certificate, baptismal records, and most importantly, a will that names her as sole beneficiary of her uncle's considerable estate." Agnes herself moved forward with growing strength and clarity, the return of her true identity seeming to restore not only her memory, but her natural courage and intelligence. "I remember now," she said, her voice gaining conviction with each word. "Mrs. Larkin wrote to me in Switzerland, claiming that Uncle Silas was gravely ill and wished to see me before he died. She arranged my travel, met me at the station, and insisted I stay at her cottage rather than the manor house." Miss Marple observed Agnes's recovery with the satisfaction of seeing long-held theories confirmed by testimony. The systematic nature of the deception was revealing itself with each recovered memory. painting a picture of conspiracy that had required months of careful planning. "What happened after your arrival?" Dr. Haydock inquired with professional gentleness. "I remember having tea with Mrs. Larkin and Mr. Pottle," Agnes continued, her recollections flowing with increasing clarity. "They seemed very interested in my travels, my financial situation, whether I had made a will of my own. The tea had a bitter taste that I attributed to unfamiliar water, but afterward—" She paused, pressing her hand to her forehead. "Everything becomes confused. I have vague memories of being dressed in unfamiliar clothing, of voices discussing plans I couldn't understand." Inspector Slack's notebook appeared with professional efficiency as he began to grasp the true scope of the deception he had been investigating. "Mrs. Larkin, these are serious accusations. What's your response to these claims?" But it was Mr. Pottle who cracked first under the weight of official scrutiny. His ecclesiastical composure, already strained by the evening's events, shattered entirely as he began speaking with the desperate urgency of someone whose carefully constructed world was collapsing. "It was never supposed to involve murder," he stammered, his voice carrying the particular anguish of someone who had allowed greed to overcome moral principle. "Mrs. Larkin said it would only be temporary confusion, just enough to make Agnes appear unstable if she tried to claim her inheritance. The killing was never part of the original plan." This admission created the crucial fracture in the conspiracy that Miss Marple had been waiting to exploit. The revelation that Silas Blackwood's death had not been part of the initial scheme suggested that something had gone catastrophically wrong with their original plan, forcing them to improvise with increasingly desperate measures. "What changed?" Inspector Slack demanded, his professional instincts sharpened by the scent of a breaking case. "If murder wasn't your intention, what drove you to kill Blackwood?" Mrs. Larkin's silence stretched across the mill like a physical presence, but Agnes provided the answer with the clarity of recovered memory. "Uncle Silas discovered what they had done to me. I remember fragments now. Raised voices from the manor house, Uncle Silas threatening to summon the police immediately, Mrs. Larkin insisting that it was too late to retreat from their plan without facing criminal charges." Miss Marple nodded with the satisfaction of seeing the final pieces fall into their proper places. Mr. Blackwood's appointment in the crypt was not with Agnes, but with Mrs. Larkin and Mr. Pottle. He intended to confront them with evidence of their conspiracy and demand Agnes's immediate release and restoration. The water wheel's ancient rhythm provided a counterpoint to these revelations as Inspector Slack worked through the implications with growing comprehension. His methodical mind was beginning to grasp the sophisticated nature of the deception that had initially appeared so straightforward. "The ceremonial mace," he said slowly. "Was it used to subdue Miss Blackwood rather than to kill her uncle?" "Precisely," Miss Marple confirmed. "Mr. Pottle used it to create the head injury that caused Agnes's amnesia, then returned it to the vestry to create confusion about the murder weapon. Meanwhile, Mr. Blackwood was killed with something else entirely. His own walking stick, I believe, with its heavy silver head." Mrs. Larkin's composure finally cracked under the weight of accumulated evidence. "He was a grasping, vindictive old man who promised me everything and then cast me aside the moment his precious niece appeared," she declared with bitter venom. "Years of devoted service, promises of marriage and inheritance, all forgotten when blood proved thicker than gratitude. So you decided to eliminate both obstacles to your ambitions," Dr. Haydock observed with professional detachment. "Agnes through discrediting her as a confused murderer, and Silas through direct violence when he discovered your scheme." Inspector Slack moved with the decisive efficiency of a man whose case had suddenly crystallized into perfect clarity. "Mrs. Larkin, Mr. Pottle, you are both under arrest for the murder of Silas Blackwood and the conspiracy to defraud Agnes Blackwood of her rightful inheritance." As his constables moved to secure the prisoners, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the particular tragedy of crimes that began with relatively modest ambitions, but escalated through fear and desperation into acts of ultimate violence. The conspiracy had been sophisticated in its planning, but ultimately undone by the same human weaknesses that had motivated it in the first place. The mill's ancient stones had witnessed the final unraveling of a deception that had transformed trusted servants into cold-blooded criminals, driven by greed and resentment into betraying the very people who had depended upon their loyalty. Yet justice, as always, had possessed its own patient methods of triumph over even the most elaborate criminal artistry. As they prepared to leave the mill and return Agnes to the safety of the vicarage, Miss Marple knew that while the mystery of the nun who had forgotten her own name had been solved, the final accounting of this complex case would require one more careful examination of the evidence and motivations that had driven ordinary people to commit extraordinary crimes. The summer fete that had begun with such innocent celebration had become the final act in a drama where memory itself had been weaponized, but truth had ultimately prevailed through the simple application of careful observation and the inexorable logic of human nature. The journey back from the mill proceeded with the measured dignity that Inspector Slack's professional training demanded, though Miss Marple observed that the evening's revelations had transformed what began as a manhunt into something requiring far more delicate handling. Agnes walked between Dr. Haydock and herself with growing steadiness, each step seeming to restore not only her physical balance but fragments of the identity that had been so systematically stripped from her. As they approached the village green where the abandoned stalls of the summer fete stood like ghostly reminders of the morning's innocent celebrations, Agnes paused with the particular stillness of someone confronting memories that carried both pain and growing understanding. "I remember more clearly now," she said quietly, her voice gaining strength with each word. "The tea that Mrs. Larkin served had a bitter aftertaste that I attributed to unfamiliar water, but afterward, everything became dreamlike and confused. I have fragmentary recollections of being dressed in unfamiliar clothing, of voices discussing plans I couldn't quite grasp, of being coached to respond to a name that felt foreign on my tongue." Inspector Slack made careful notes, his methodical mind working through the implications of such elaborate preparation. Miss Marple observed that the inspector's initial confidence in his straightforward theory had given way to the more complex satisfaction of a professional confronting a truly sophisticated criminal enterprise. "The confusion persisted for days," Agnes continued, her hand moving instinctively to her temple where the injury had been inflicted. "But underneath the chemical fog, some part of my mind remained aware that I was in terrible danger. That's why I guarded the key so protectively. Some deep instinct told me it was crucial to my survival, though I couldn't understand why." Dr. Haydock's professional interest was clearly engaged by the medical aspects of the case. The drug would need to be something that created confusion without complete incapacitation. Laudanum mixed with a sedative, perhaps, or one of the newer compounds that affect memory formation while leaving basic motor functions intact. As they reached the vicarage gate, Griselda Clement emerged with the particular urgency of someone who had been anxiously awaiting news. Her relief at seeing Agnes safe and Inspector Slack's obvious satisfaction with the evening's work was tempered by the gravity of what had been uncovered. "Jane, thank goodness you're all safe," Griselda said, ushering them into the warmth of the vicarage. "The entire village has been in an uproar since word spread about the arrests. Mrs. Price Ridley has been beside herself with curiosity, and Colonel Bantry has been holding forth about the declining trustworthiness of domestic staff." The vicarage parlor, with its peaceful domesticity and gentle lamplight, provided sanctuary where the evening's complex revelations could be properly examined. Agnes settled into the comfortable armchair where she had first begun to recover her true identity, while Inspector Slack positioned himself to continue his methodical documentation. It was then that Mrs. Henderson arrived, still visibly shaken by her morning discovery, but carrying herself with the particular determination of someone who had been wrestling with troubling recollections. She entered the parlor with obvious hesitation, clearly bearing additional information that had been weighing on her mind. "Inspector Slack," she began nervously. "I've been thinking about what I observed this morning, and there are details I failed to mention in my initial statement. The shock of finding poor Mr. Blackwood made me focus on the obvious horror, but now I realize there were other things that seemed peculiar." Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm as she prepared to absorb whatever new intelligence Mrs. Henderson might provide. Experience had taught her that witnesses often recalled crucial details only after the immediate trauma had subsided sufficiently to allow clearer thinking. "What sort of details, Mrs. Henderson?" Dr. Haydock inquired with professional gentleness. "The arrangement of the scene troubled me, though I couldn't articulate why at the time," Mrs. Henderson explained, her voice growing stronger as she organized her thoughts. Mr. Blackwood's walking stick, the heavy one with the silver head that he always carried, was placed very precisely beside the body, as if someone had positioned it there deliberately rather than letting it fall naturally. Inspector Slack's attention sharpened immediately. "Are you certain about this observation?" "Quite certain, Inspector. I've arranged flowers for 23 years, and I notice when objects have been placed rather than dropped. There was something almost ceremonial about the positioning, as if someone wished to ensure it would be noticed and examined." This revelation aligned perfectly with Miss Marple's growing theory about the deliberate creation of evidence designed to confuse the investigation. The careful placement of the walking stick suggested not the chaos of sudden violence, but the methodical thinking of someone who understood how crime scenes were interpreted by authorities. Agnes stirred in her chair with the alertness of someone whose memories were continuing to surface with increasing clarity. "I remember sounds now," she said slowly, her brow furrowing with concentration. "Not just voices, but a pattern of sounds that repeated several times during my confused period. Church bells, but not the regular chimes. Someone pulling the bell rope in an irregular pattern. 3 short pulls, then 2 long ones. It happened at the same time each day." Dr. Haydock exchanged a significant glance with Miss Marple. "A signal system, perhaps. A way for the conspirators to coordinate their activities without attracting attention through more obvious means of communication." The implication was chilling in its sophistication. The conspiracy had operated not as a crime of passion or sudden opportunity, but as a carefully orchestrated campaign that required precise timing and coordination between multiple participants. Inspector Slack's notebook filled steadily with these accumulating details, each revelation adding another layer to the picture of premeditation that had characterized the entire enterprise. "Mrs. Henderson, you mentioned the ceremonial mace was in its proper place when you collected the crypt key this morning?" "Indeed, Inspector. In the vestry, polished and positioned exactly as it should be. Though now that I think about it, it did seem unusually bright, as if someone had cleaned it very recently and very thoroughly." Miss Marple absorbed this confirmation of her theory while recognizing that several crucial elements still required examination. The systematic nature of the conspiracy suggested planning that extended far beyond the immediate crime, and she suspected that Agnes's inheritance represented only the most recent target of a criminal enterprise that had been operating successfully for considerably longer. "Agnes, my dear," she said gently, "the letter that summoned you from Switzerland. Do you recall any specific details about its composition or delivery?" Agnes nodded with growing certainty. "It bore Uncle Silas's signature, but something about the handwriting troubled me. The letter formation was similar but not identical to his usual correspondence. I attributed the differences to illness affecting his penmanship, but now I suspect the reality was rather different." "Mrs. Larkin forged his signature," Inspector Slack concluded grimly, "which suggests this conspiracy required considerable preparation and planning, not a sudden decision driven by immediate circumstances." As the evening drew toward its close and the various threads of evidence wove themselves into an increasingly complete picture, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the particular tragedy of trust systematically betrayed and loyalty corrupted by long-nurtured resentment and greed. The conspiracy had succeeded for as long as it had, precisely because Mrs. Larkin's position as a faithful housekeeper had placed her above suspicion, allowing her to operate with devastating effectiveness within the very heart of the household she was systematically betraying. But even as the immediate mystery approached its resolution, Miss Marple recognized that the full scope of Mrs. Larkin's criminal activities remained to be uncovered. The silver candlestick and its hidden compartments suggested a woman who had been conducting an entire career of fraud and deception, using her position of domestic trust to gain access to the personal documents and financial information necessary for systematic criminal enterprise. The mystery of the nun who had forgotten her own name had revealed itself as merely the latest and most ambitious chapter in a story of betrayal that reached far deeper into the quiet corruption of ordinary human relationships than anyone in Little Wickham had yet imagined. The implications of Mrs. Henderson's observations about the deliberately positioned walking stick continued to resonate through the vicarage parlor as the evening deepened around Little Wickham. Miss Marple found herself increasingly convinced that the systematic nature of the evidence pointed toward a criminal enterprise far more sophisticated than a simple village murder, and the silver candlestick on the table before them held secrets that extended well beyond the immediate conspiracy. Dr. Haydock positioned the ornate piece where the lamplight could reveal its intricate craftsmanship, but Miss Marple's experienced eye detected the subtle anomalies that spoke of purposes beyond mere decoration. The base, which she had discovered could be unscrewed, showed clear signs of frequent manipulation, while traces within the hidden compartment suggested it had served as a repository for various documents over an extended period. This was not simply a hiding place for the papers Agnes discovered, Miss Marple observed, examining the interior with careful attention. The wear patterns suggest regular use, and the size of the compartment indicates it was designed to transport materials regularly and discreetly. Mrs. Larkin's position as trusted housekeeper would have given her access to personal papers, financial records, and intimate knowledge of household routines. Information that could be systematically exploited with the right tools and methods. Agnes stirred with growing recognition as fragments of memory continued to surface. I remember seeing that candlestick in Uncle Silas's study, always positioned precisely on his desk. He was quite particular about its placement, but I never suspected it might serve such a purpose. During my confused days at Mrs. Larkin's cottage, I recall seeing her handling similar objects with great care, wrapping them in cloth and placing them in that leather valise she insisted I use for my journey. Inspector Slack's methodical mind was clearly working through the broader implications of this revelation. If Mrs. Larkin had been using such methods to access and copy important documents, she could have been operating this type of fraud for years. The Blackwood case might represent only the most recent and ambitious of her criminal enterprises. This disturbing possibility was confirmed when young Tommy Fletcher appeared once again at the vicarage door, his face bearing the particular excitement of someone who had made a crucial connection. Griselda admitted him with quiet efficiency, recognizing the boy's talent for uncovering significant information at precisely the right moments. "Miss Marple," Tommy announced breathlessly, "I've been thinking about those bell signals Miss Agnes mentioned, and I remembered something important. Yesterday evening, when I was delivering bread near the church, I heard that same pattern, 3 short pulls and 2 long ones. But it came from the direction of Mrs. Larkin's cottage, not from the church bell tower." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused as she absorbed this crucial intelligence. "A communication system," she murmured thoughtfully. Mrs. Larkin could coordinate activities with Confederates positioned throughout the village without attracting the attention that more obvious forms of contact might have generated. Even as they discussed these revelations, the sound they had been unconsciously expecting finally came. The distant chiming of church bells, but not in the regular pattern of hourly chimes. 3 quick peals, followed by 2 longer ones, echoed across the village green, carrying with them the unmistakable message that someone was still operating the conspiracy's communication network. Dr. Haydock moved to the window with immediate concern. Someone is still out there, still coordinating activities. The arrests of Mrs. Larkin and Mr. Pottle haven't ended this business. Inspector Slack rose with the decisive efficiency of a man whose case had suddenly revealed new dimensions. Then we'll discover who's pulling those bells and what they're hoping to accomplish. This conspiracy clearly extends beyond the two we've apprehended. As they prepared to investigate the source of the signals, Mrs. Price Ridley arrived with information that cast the evening's discoveries in an even more disturbing light. Her usual talent for village intelligence had led her to connections that revealed the true scope of what they were confronting. "Inspector Slack," she began with unusual urgency, "I've been thinking about the various strangers who have passed through Little Wickham over recent months. At least 3 different individuals have made inquiries about property values, inheritance laws, and procedures for challenging wills. Each claimed to be conducting academic research, but their questions were remarkably specific to local circumstances and elderly residents without immediate heirs." Miss Marple absorbed this intelligence with the careful attention she gave to all potentially significant patterns. The suggestion that Mrs. Larkin's activities had involved not only local accomplices but external experts indicated a criminal network of considerable scope and professional organization. Agnes had grown pale as she listened to these revelations, clearly grasping the implications for her own narrow escape and recognizing how systematically she had been targeted. "The leather valise Mrs. Larkin insisted I use," she said with dawning horror. "It wasn't mine at all. She claimed my own luggage was too cumbersome for the train journey and said she'd sent my bags directly to the manor house. I never saw them again." The systematic nature of the deception was revealing itself with chilling clarity. Mrs. Larkin had not merely improvised a desperate scheme, but had been operating a sophisticated criminal enterprise that required careful planning, professional assistance, and ongoing coordination between multiple participants positioned throughout the community. As the church bells fell silent and the village settled into an uneasy quiet, Miss Marple found herself recognizing that while they had successfully unraveled the immediate conspiracy and rescued Agnes from its deadly consequences, the full scope of the criminal network remained to be discovered. The mystery of the nun who had forgotten her own name had revealed itself as merely the most visible manifestation of a corruption that had been festering beneath the surface of their peaceful community for far longer than anyone had suspected. The evening's investigation had transformed their understanding from a village murder to something approaching organized criminal enterprise, and Miss Marple prepared herself for the revelation that the true scope of the conspiracy would prove far more extensive and dangerous than even her experienced imagination had yet conceived. The bell signals echoing across Little Wickham carried with them the promise that the most crucial confrontations were yet to come. The echo of the irregular bell signals still resonated across Little Wickham when Inspector Slack organized his response with the methodical efficiency that the evening's revelations demanded. Miss Marple observed his deployment of constables with quiet satisfaction, noting how the inspector's initial confidence in simple solutions had evolved into the more complex appreciation that sophisticated crimes required equally sophisticated investigation. Dr. Haydock positioned himself near the vicarage telephone, ready to coordinate with authorities beyond the village boundaries, while Agnes remained in the parlor, where her steadily recovering memories continued to provide crucial intelligence about the conspiracy's scope and methods. The systematic nature of her victimization was becoming increasingly clear with each fragment of recollection. The bell signals originated from the church tower itself, Inspector Slack reported upon his return, his expression carrying both satisfaction and concern. "We've apprehended Amos Reed, the sexton, operating a carefully rehearsed communication system, but his revelations suggest we're confronting something far more extensive than a village murder conspiracy." Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm as she prepared to absorb whatever new intelligence the evening might provide. Experience had taught her that the most crucial discoveries often emerged when criminals believed their carefully laid plans were collapsing around them. Amos Reed, when brought to the vicarage for questioning, presented the particular tragedy of a man whose modest position had been corrupted by promises of financial security that had gradually transformed him into an unwilling accomplice to increasingly serious crimes. His weathered hands trembled as he recounted his role in the elaborate deception. "I was to ring the patterns when instructed," he explained with the defeated air of someone whose carefully maintained secrets had finally been exposed. 3 short and 2 long meant proceed as planned. 2 short and 3 long meant abort immediately. But tonight's pattern was different, a warning that the entire operation had been compromised. Inspector Slack's notebook filled steadily with these revelations, each detail adding another layer to their understanding of the conspiracy's sophisticated coordination. "Who gave you these instructions, Mr. Reed?" "A gentleman from London," Amos replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Never gave his proper name, but Mrs. Larkin called him the coordinator. Dressed like a solicitor or bank manager, spoke with a sort of authority that made you believe he could arrange anything legal-like. He paid well and promised that no real harm would come to anyone. Miss Marple absorbed this description with particular interest, recognizing the type of criminal who operated through the manipulation of legitimate authority rather than obvious intimidation. Such individuals were often the most dangerous because they understood how to exploit the very systems designed to protect their victims. Agnes stirred with growing recognition as Amos described the mysterious coordinator. "I remember him now," she said with dawning clarity. "He visited Mrs. Larkin's cottage while I was there, claiming to be handling legal matters related to Uncle Silas's estate. He was very interested in my condition, asking detailed questions about my memory and whether I retained any knowledge of legal procedures." Dr. Haydock leaned forward with professional concern. "What sort of questions specifically?" "Whether I could recall the location of important documents, the names of Uncle Silas's solicitors, details about property boundaries and inheritance procedures." At the time, I thought he was being professionally thorough, but his interest seemed particularly focused on what I might remember about a sealed envelope that Uncle Silas had mentioned in his letters. This revelation provided the crucial missing piece that Miss Marple had been seeking. The conspiracy had not merely targeted Agnes for her inheritance, but had been searching for specific documents that Silas Blackwood had hidden as protection against exactly this sort of systematic fraud. Inspector Slack's investigation of Amos Reed's possessions revealed the physical evidence that confirmed their theories. Hidden in the bell tower, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a collection of forged documents, blank legal forms, and correspondence that painted a picture of criminal enterprise extending far beyond Little Wickham's boundaries. These letters reference operations in at least 6 different counties, Inspector Slack reported with growing gravity. Elderly residents without immediate heirs, systematic research into property values and inheritance laws, coordinated efforts to identify and exploit vulnerable targets. This represents years of careful planning and professional criminal activity. Miss Marple examined the correspondence with her characteristic attention to detail, noting the quality of the paper, the precision of the language, and most significantly, the careful avoidance of specific names or locations that might provide concrete evidence. The criminal coordinator had operated with the cautious intelligence of someone who understood exactly how such investigations proceeded. But even as they absorbed these revelations, the sound of approaching footsteps announced an unexpected arrival. Through the vicarage window, Miss Marple observed a figure moving across the village green with the confident stride of someone who believed himself to be operating under legitimate authority. The gentleman who approached. The vicarage door presented exactly the appearance that Amos Reed had described. Well-dressed, professionally dignified, carrying himself with the sort of quiet authority that would gain him admission to any respectable household. His knock carried the measured confidence of someone accustomed to being received without question. "Inspector Slack," Miss Marple said quietly. "I believe our mysterious coordinator has decided that the evening's developments require his personal attention. He undoubtedly expects to find a confused village dealing with a simple murder case, not a systematic investigation into organized criminal fraud." Inspector Slack positioned his constables with silent efficiency, while Griselda Clement answered the door with her usual hospitality, admitting the visitor with the courtesy that English social conventions demanded even under extraordinary circumstances. The gentleman entered the vicarage parlor with professional composure, his sharp eyes taking in the assembled group with the quick assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating situations for potential advantage or danger. When his gaze fell upon Agnes, Miss Marple observed the barely perceptible tightening around his eyes that indicated recognition and concern. "Good evening," he said with practiced courtesy, producing a calling card with elegant efficiency. "Mr. Pemberton, representing Pemberton, Wickham and Associates, solicitors. I understand there have been some distressing events in the village, and I've come to ensure that Miss Blackwood's legal interests are properly protected during this difficult time." Miss Marple's experienced intuition recognized immediately that this was not the genuine Mr. Pemberton, whose practice Dr. Haydock had mentioned earlier, but rather the criminal coordinator, whose careful planning was now threatened by the evening's discoveries. The calling card would undoubtedly prove to be as expertly forged as the other documents they had uncovered. "How very thoughtful of you to call at such a late hour," Miss Marple observed with gentle courtesy that carried beneath it the steel of absolute certainty. "Though I believe Inspector Slack may have some questions about your particular interest in Miss Blackwood's affairs, given the rather extensive correspondence we've discovered regarding systematic fraud targeting elderly residents throughout the region." The false solicitor's composure wavered for just a moment, long enough for Miss Marple to observe the calculation behind his professional facade, and for Inspector Slack to step forward with the authority of official arrest. The mystery of the nun who had forgotten her own name was approaching its final resolution, but that resolution would require one last demonstration of how even the most sophisticated criminal deception could not ultimately prevail against patient observation and the inexorable logic of human nature. As the church bells of St. Bartholomew's chimed midnight across the village green, Miss Marple prepared to reveal how the threads of evidence, memory, and careful deduction had woven themselves into a pattern that would finally bring justice to little Wickham and protection to the countless other potential victims who remained unaware of the systematic predation that had been operating beneath the peaceful surface of English village life. The echo of the irregular bell signals still resonated across Little Wickham when Inspector Slack organized his response with the methodical efficiency that the evening's revelations demanded. Miss Marple observed his deployment of constables with quiet satisfaction, noting how the inspector's initial confidence in simple solutions had evolved into the more complex appreciation that sophisticated crimes required equally sophisticated investigation. Dr. Haydock positioned himself near the vicarage telephone, ready to coordinate with authorities beyond the village boundaries, while Agnes remained in the parlor where her steadily recovering memories continued to provide crucial intelligence about the conspiracy's scope and methods. The systematic nature of her victimization was becoming increasingly clear with each fragment of recollection. The bell signals originated from the church tower itself, Inspector Slack reported upon his return, his expression carrying both satisfaction and concern. "We've apprehended Amos Reed, the sexton, operating a carefully rehearsed communication system. But his revelations suggest we're confronting something far more extensive than a village murder conspiracy." Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm as she prepared to absorb whatever new intelligence the evening might provide. Experience had taught her that the most crucial discoveries often emerged when criminals believed their carefully laid plans were collapsing around them. Amos Reed, when brought to the vicarage for questioning, presented the particular tragedy of a man whose modest position had been corrupted by promises of financial security that had gradually transformed him into an unwilling accomplice to increasingly serious crimes. His weathered hands trembled as he recounted his role in the elaborate deception. "I was to ring the patterns when instructed," he explained with the defeated air of someone whose carefully maintained secrets had finally been exposed. 3 short and 2 long meant proceed as planned. 2 short and 3 long meant abort immediately. But tonight's pattern was different, a warning that the entire operation had been compromised. Inspector Slack's notebook filled steadily with these revelations, each detail adding another layer to their understanding of the conspiracy's sophisticated coordination. "Who gave you these instructions, Mr. Reed?" "A gentleman from London," Amos replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Never gave his proper name, but Mrs. Larkin called him the coordinator. Dressed like a solicitor or bank manager, spoke with a sort of authority that made you believe he could arrange anything legal-like. He paid well and promised that no real harm would come to anyone." Miss Marple absorbed this description with particular interest, recognizing the type of criminal who operated through the manipulation of legitimate authority rather than obvious intimidation. Such individuals were often the most dangerous because they understood how to exploit the very systems designed to protect their victims. Agnes stirred with growing recognition as Amos described the mysterious coordinator. "I remember him now," she said with dawning clarity. "He visited Mrs. Larkin's cottage while I was there, claiming to be handling legal matters related to Uncle Silas's estate. He was very interested in my condition, asking detailed questions about my memory and whether I retained any knowledge of legal procedures." Dr. Haydock leaned forward with professional concern. "What sort of questions specifically?" "Whether I could recall the location of important documents, the names of Uncle Silas's solicitors, details about property boundaries and inheritance procedures. At the time, I thought he was being professionally thorough, but his interest seemed particularly focused on what I might remember about a sealed envelope that Uncle Silas had mentioned in his letters." This revelation provided the crucial missing piece that Miss Marple had been seeking. The conspiracy had not merely targeted Agnes for her inheritance, but had been searching for specific documents that Silas Blackwood had hidden as protection against exactly this sort of systematic fraud. Inspector Slack's investigation of Amos Reed's possessions revealed the physical evidence that confirmed their theories. Hidden in the bell tower, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a collection of forged documents, blank legal forms, and correspondence that painted a picture of criminal enterprise extending far beyond Little Wickham's boundaries. "These letters reference operations in at least 6 different counties," Inspector Slack reported with growing gravity. "Elderly residents without immediate heirs, systematic research into property values and inheritance laws, coordinated efforts to identify and exploit vulnerable targets. This represents years of careful planning and professional criminal activity." Miss Marple examined the correspondence with her characteristic attention to detail, noting the quality of the paper, the precision of the language, and most significantly, the careful avoidance of specific names or locations that might provide concrete evidence. The criminal coordinator had operated with the cautious intelligence of someone who understood exactly how such investigations proceeded. But even as they absorbed these revelations, the sound of approaching footsteps announced an unexpected arrival. Through the vicarage window, Miss Marple observed a figure moving across the village green with the confident stride of someone who believed himself to be operating under legitimate authority. The gentleman who approached the vicarage door presented exactly the appearance that Amos Reed had described. Well-dressed, professionally dignified, carrying himself with the sort of quiet authority that would gain him admission to any respectable household. His knock carried the measured confidence of someone accustomed to being received without question. "Inspector Slack," Miss Marple said quietly, "I believe our mysterious coordinator has decided that the evening's developments require his personal attention. He undoubtedly expects to find a confused village dealing with a simple murder case, not a systematic investigation into organized criminal fraud. Inspector Slack positioned his constables with silent efficiency, while Griselda Clement answered the door with her usual hospitality, admitting the visitor with a courtesy that English social conventions demanded even under extraordinary circumstances. The gentleman entered the vicarage parlor with professional composure, his sharp eyes taking in the assembled group with the quick assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating situations for potential advantage or danger. When his gaze fell upon Agnes, Miss Marple observed the barely perceptible tightening around his eyes that indicated recognition and concern. "Good evening," he said with practiced courtesy, producing a calling card with elegant efficiency. "Mr. Pemberton, representing Pemberton, Wickham and Associates, solicitors. I understand there have been some distressing events in the village, and I've come to ensure that Miss Blackwood's legal interests are properly protected during this difficult time." Miss Marple's experienced intuition recognized immediately that this was not the genuine Mr. Pemberton, whose practice Dr. Haydock had mentioned earlier, but rather the criminal coordinator, whose careful planning was now threatened by the evening's discoveries. The calling card would undoubtedly prove to be as expertly forged as the other documents they had uncovered. "How very thoughtful of you to call at such a late hour," Miss Marple observed with gentle courtesy that carried beneath it the steel of absolute certainty. "Though I believe Inspector Slack may have some questions about your particular interest in Miss Blackwood's affairs, given the rather extensive correspondence we've discovered regarding systematic fraud targeting elderly residents throughout the region." The false solicitor's composure wavered for just a moment, long enough for Miss Marple to observe the calculation behind his professional facade, and for Inspector Slack to step forward with the authority of official arrest. The mystery of the nun who had forgotten her own name was approaching its final resolution, but that resolution would require one last demonstration of how even the most sophisticated criminal deception could not ultimately prevail against patient observation and the inexorable logic of human nature. As the church bells of St. Bartholomew's chimed midnight across the village green, Miss Marple prepared to reveal how the threads of evidence, memory, and careful deduction had woven themselves into a pattern that would finally bring justice to Little Wickham and protection to the countless other potential victims who remained unaware of the systematic predation that had been operating beneath the peaceful surface of English village life. The false Mr. Pemberton's professional composure carried with it the practiced confidence of a man accustomed to manipulating situations through the careful deployment of legitimate authority. But Miss Marple observed the subtle tension around his eyes that suggested someone operating well beyond his comfort zone. His briefcase rested beside his chair with the particular precision of someone whose possessions were arranged for quick access, and his gloved hands moved with the careful economy of gesture that spoke of long practice in concealing nervous energy. "I do apologize for calling at such a late hour," he said with cultivated courtesy, producing documents from his briefcase with theatrical efficiency. "However, the circumstances surrounding Miss Blackwood's inheritance require immediate attention, particularly given the distressing events that have occurred. I trust you understand the importance of protecting her legal interests during this vulnerable period." Inspector Slack accepted the proffered credentials with the methodical attention that the evening's revelations had taught him to apply to all claims of authority. The documents appeared professionally prepared, letterhead properly embossed, signatures appropriately confident, legal language precisely formatted. Yet Miss Marple noted the particular quality of attention the false solicitor paid to their examination, as if gauging their effectiveness rather than simply presenting routine identification. "How very thorough of you to arrive so promptly," Miss Marple observed with gentle courtesy, her knitting needles resuming their rhythmic clicking. "Though I confess myself curious about how you learned of Miss Blackwood's situation so quickly, given that her true identity has only just been established this evening." The question hung in the air with deceptive innocence. but Miss Marple observed the barely perceptible tightening around the man's eyes that indicated recognition of the trap embedded within seemingly polite conversation. His response came with practiced smoothness, yet carried beneath it the particular strain of someone improvising under pressure. "Professional networks operate with considerable efficiency, madam. Word of significant legal matters travels quickly among those responsible for protecting substantial estates." He turned to Agnes with renewed focus, as if seeking to establish direct communication that might bypass the uncomfortable scrutiny of the assembled observers. "Miss Blackwood, I trust you. Understand that certain documents may require your immediate attention, particularly any sealed materials that your uncle might have prepared for safekeeping." This reference to sealed documents confirmed Miss Marple's growing suspicions about the true purpose of his visit. The systematic nature of his inquiry suggested not legitimate legal concern, but desperate searching for specific materials that posed a direct threat to the criminal network's continued operation. Agnes stirred with growing recognition as fragments of memory continued to surface with increasing clarity. "I remember you now," she said with dawning understanding. "You visited Mrs. Larkin's cottage while I was there, asking detailed questions about my uncle's papers and whether I retained knowledge of his business arrangements. At the time, I thought you were being professionally thorough. But your questions seemed particularly focused on documents he might have hidden for protection against fraud." Dr. Haydock leaned forward with professional interest as Agnes's recollections provided crucial intelligence about the conspiracy's methods and objectives. "What specific information did he seek, Agnes?" "Details about Uncle Silas's correspondence with authorities, his investigations into suspicious deaths in the area, and most significantly, the location of evidence he had gathered about systematic fraud targeting elderly residents without immediate heirs." Agnes's voice grew stronger as her memory cleared, revealing the true scope of what they were confronting. Uncle Silas had been conducting his own investigation for months, documenting patterns of suspicious deaths and altered wills that suggested organized criminal activity. Miss Marple positioned the silver candlestick where the lamplight would reveal its ornate craftsmanship, noting with particular interest how the false solicitor's attention fixed immediately upon the decorative piece. "Such a lovely example of ecclesiastical metalwork," she observed conversationally. "The base unscrews quite cleverly, revealing a hidden compartment that has obviously seen considerable use over recent months." The psychological effect of this revelation was immediate and profound. The false solicitor's professional composure wavered as he recognized that his carefully constructed deception was collapsing under the weight of accumulated evidence. His sharp eyes moved from the candlestick to the assembled observers, clearly calculating the possibilities for salvaging a situation that had deteriorated far beyond his original expectations. "Inspector Slack," Miss Marple continued with gentle authority, "I believe you will find that Mr. Pemberton's briefcase contains rather more than routine legal documents. The systematic nature of this conspiracy required considerable preparation, including forged credentials, blank legal forms, and detailed intelligence about potential victims gathered through years of careful observation." Inspector Slack's examination of the briefcase revealed exactly what Miss Marple had predicted. Hidden compartments contained an extensive collection of forged documents, multiple sets of credentials bearing different names, and, most damning of all, a detailed ledger documenting criminal activities across 6 counties. The systematic nature of the fraud network was laid bare in meticulous handwriting that recorded property values, family circumstances, and vulnerability assessments with the cold precision of a business enterprise. These records document operations extending back at least 5 years, Inspector Slack reported with growing gravity. Elderly residents systematically targeted, their deaths made to appear natural while their estates were diverted through fraudulent legal procedures. We're dealing with serial murder disguised as inheritance law. The false solicitor's silence stretched across the vicarage parlour as the full scope of his criminal enterprise was revealed, but Miss Marple recognized that the most crucial element remained to be addressed. The conspiracy had succeeded for years precisely because it operated through the exploitation of trust and the manipulation of social conventions that made communities vulnerable to systematic predation. "The beauty of your scheme," Miss Marple observed with clinical detachment, "lay in its exploitation of the very systems designed to protect vulnerable individuals. Mrs. Larkin's position as trusted housekeeper provided access to private documents and intimate knowledge of household routines. Mr. Pottle's ecclesiastical authority offered both sanctuary and communication methods. Your own credentials as a legal professional ensured that official inquiries would be deflected rather than pursued." Agnes had grown pale as the full implications of her narrow escape became clear. "The sealed envelope Uncle Silas mentioned contained evidence of your previous crimes. That's why you needed to eliminate both of us. Him, because he was preparing to expose the network, and me because I might eventually remember enough to corroborate his findings." "Precisely," Miss Marple confirmed. "The murder of Silas Blackwood was not improvised violence, but calculated elimination of a threat to your entire operation. The elaborate scheme to frame Agnes as a confused murderer would have provided perfect cover for seizing the Blackwood estate while ensuring that the only potential witness to your crimes was discredited beyond any possibility of effective testimony." Inspector Slack moved forward with decisive authority, his constables positioning themselves to prevent any attempt at escape. "You are under arrest for the murder of Silas Blackwood and conspiracy to defraud multiple victims across several counties. The evidence against you and your network is overwhelming." As the false solicitor was led away, his professional mask finally slipping to reveal the bitter resentment and calculating cruelty that had driven years of systematic criminal activity, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the particular tragedy of trust systematically betrayed and loyalty corrupted by long-nurtured greed and ambition. The vicarage parlour, relieved of the tension that had dominated the evening's revelations, seemed to exhale with collective relief. Agnes sat quietly with her hands around a cup of tea, the simple domesticity of the gesture marking her return not only to her true identity but to the ordinary world of safety and legitimate human connection. "The mystery of the nun who forgot her own name," Miss Marple observed gently, "has revealed itself as something far more complex than a village murder. It was an elaborate deception designed to exploit the very qualities of trust and community that make civilized life possible. But justice, as always, has its own patient methods of triumph over even the most sophisticated criminal artistry." As the midnight bells of St. Bartholomew's chimed across the village green and Little Wickham settled into the peaceful sleep of a community restored to safety, Miss Marple prepared for the final accounting that would bring complete resolution to a case that had begun with such deceptive innocence at the summer fete. The truth had prevailed through the careful application of observation, deduction, and the inexorable logic of human nature, proving once again that no conspiracy, however elaborate, could ultimately succeed against the patient unraveling of deception and the restoration of justice to those who had been systematically betrayed. The vicarage parlour, which had served as the crucible for the evening's extraordinary revelations, now settled into a quieter rhythm as Inspector Slack's constables efficiently processed the arrested conspirators. The false solicitor's professional composure had finally cracked entirely, revealing beneath it the calculating cruelty that had enabled years of systematic predation against vulnerable members of communities across multiple counties. Miss Marple observed the proceedings with the particular satisfaction of someone whose patient deductions had finally borne fruit, though her expression carried also the weight of understanding how much suffering might have been prevented had the conspiracy been exposed earlier. Agnes sat quietly beside the fire, wrapped in one of Griselda's shawls, her recovered identity bringing with it not only relief, but the growing comprehension of how systematically she had been victimized. It began with careful observation. Miss Marple explained to Inspector Slack as he completed his preliminary notes. Mrs. Larkin had spent years in Silas Blackwood's household, learning his habits, his correspondence patterns, his relationships with family members. When she discovered that Agnes was his sole heir, and that her own expectations of marriage and inheritance were to be disappointed, she began planning with remarkable thoroughness. Dr. Haydock leaned forward with professional interest as Agnes's memories continued to surface with increasing clarity. "The forged letter summoning me from Switzerland was only the beginning," Agnes said, her voice growing stronger with each recovered detail. "Mrs. Larkin met me at the station, insisting that Uncle Silas was too ill to receive visitors at the manor. She took me to her cottage, where everything seemed so solicitous and caring. The laudanum in the tea," Miss Marple continued gently, "combined with one of those newer sedative compounds that interfere with memory formation while leaving basic motor functions intact. Dr. Haydock would recognize the symptoms: confusion, temporal disorientation, the particular vulnerability that makes suggestion so effective." Inspector Slack's methodical mind was working through the implications with growing comprehension. And the religious costume was hired, not stolen. The hem had been let down hastily, leaving that telltale line that caught your attention, Miss Marple. Indeed, Mrs. Larkin understood that a confused nun would attract sympathy rather than suspicion, while providing the perfect explanation for any odd behavior or gaps in memory. The brass key was placed in Agnes's possession to ensure she would be found with access to the church crypt, while the convenient amnesia would prevent her from providing any coherent defense. Agnes shuddered as she recalled the fragments of those lost days. "I remember being coached to respond to the name Sister Mary Clements, though it felt foreign on my tongue. There were voices discussing plans I couldn't quite grasp, and always that underlying terror that I couldn't explain but couldn't ignore." "Your instincts were trying to protect you," Dr. Haydock assured her with professional gentleness. "Some part of your mind remained aware of the danger, which is why you guarded that key so protectively and why you reacted with such fear to unexpected sounds." Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm as she considered the broader implications of what they had uncovered. The silver candlestick was perhaps the most ingenious element of their operation. Hidden in plain sight, it could be carried anywhere without attracting attention, while its secret compartment allowed for the discreet transport of forged documents, copied keys, and other materials essential to their systematic fraud. Inspector Slack's investigation had revealed the true scope of the criminal network through the documents found in the false solicitor's briefcase. "These records document operations extending back at least 7 years, he reported with gravity. Elderly residents systematically targeted across 12 counties, their deaths made to appear natural, while their estates were diverted through fraudulent legal procedures. The revelation that Silas Blackwood's murder had been intended to eliminate not just a troublesome individual, but a coordinated investigation into the network's activities, cast the entire conspiracy in an even more sinister light. His appointment in the crypt had been arranged to confront Mrs. Larkin and demand Agnes's immediate release, but the conspirators had chosen violence over exposure. The ceremonial mace, Miss Marple observed, served a dual purpose. Mr. Pottle used it to create Agnes's head injury and amnesia, then returned it to the vestry to create confusion about the murder weapon. Meanwhile, Silas Blackwood was killed with his own walking stick, which was then carefully positioned to suggest a struggle. As the first light of dawn began to illuminate the village green, where the abandoned stalls of the summer fete stood like ghostly reminders of the morning's innocent celebrations, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the particular tragedy of trust systematically betrayed. The conspiracy had succeeded for years, precisely because it exploited the very qualities that made civilized communities possible: trust in authority, deference to professional credentials, and the assumption that those in positions of care would act with genuine concern for their charges. Agnes stirred with growing determination as her strength returned. Uncle Silas's evidence must be used to ensure justice for all their victims, not merely for the crimes committed against us. How many others suffered while this network operated with impunity? That will be determined by the broader investigation, Inspector Slack assured her. We're coordinating with authorities across multiple counties to reopen cases that were previously considered closed. Your uncle's documentation may prove invaluable in securing justice for victims whose deaths were accepted as natural when they were actually murder. As the morning light strengthened and the village began to stir with the quiet activity of Sunday preparations, Miss Marple prepared to take her leave. The mystery of the nun who had forgotten her own name had revealed itself as something far more complex than a village murder, an elaborate conspiracy that had corrupted the very relationships designed to protect the vulnerable. People are not one thing, Miss Marple observed gently to Agnes as they prepared to part. A woman may nurse a child tenderly and then commit murder with calculated precision. The capacity for both kindness and cruelty exists within us all, which is what makes our world both comfortable and dangerous in equal measure. The bells of St. Bartholomew's began their morning call to worship, ringing properly now, for service rather than sinister signals. Little Wickham would heal from this violation of its peaceful order, though it would long remember the day when a summer fete had become the stage for revelations that reached into the darkest corners of human nature and criminal ambition. As Miss Marple walked home through the quiet lanes where cow parsley feathered the ditches and the scent of damp earth rose clean and good, she carried with her the satisfaction of justice served and truth revealed. The mystery had been solved through patient observation and the inexorable logic of human behavior, proving once again that even the most sophisticated deception could not ultimately prevail against careful attention to the small details that reveal the larger pattern of human nature. The Sunday morning that dawned over Little Wickham carried with it the particular quality of peace that follows great storms, though Miss Marple recognized that the village would require considerable time to heal from the systematic betrayal that had been revealed. The bells of St. Bartholomew's rang with their proper dignity for morning service, and those who gathered did so with the subdued demeanor of a community that had discovered darkness beneath its peaceful surface. Agnes had spent the night at the vicarage, where Griselda's motherly care and Dr. Haydock's professional attention had helped restore both her physical strength and the clarity of mind that her true identity brought with it. She sat now in the morning light, wrapped in one of Griselda's shawls, her face bearing the particular serenity of someone who had survived systematic victimization and emerged with both courage and compassion intact. "I find myself thinking of Uncle Silas," Agnes said quietly, as Miss Marple joined her for breakfast. "His letters always carried such formality, such distance. I attributed it to his natural temperament, but now I wonder if he was protecting himself from disappointment, having been betrayed so systematically by those he trusted." Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm as she considered the psychological complexities that the case had revealed. "Perhaps, my dear. Trust, once broken, creates wounds that heal slowly, if at all. Your uncle may have learned to guard his heart as carefully as he guarded his evidence." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Reverend Clement, whose usual gentle demeanor carried with it a gravity befitting the extraordinary circumstances his parish had witnessed. He approached with the measured steps of someone bearing news of particular significance. "Miss Marple, Agnes," he said with quiet urgency, "I believe there may be one final element to this terrible business that requires attention. While preparing for this morning's service, I discovered something in the church that I believe Silas Blackwood intended you to find." They followed him across the village green, where the abandoned stalls of the summer fete stood like ghostly reminders of the innocence that had been shattered by the previous day's revelations. The church interior carried its ancient coolness, but Miss Marple noted immediately that the morning light fell differently across the stone walls, illuminating details that had remained hidden in yesterday's dramatic shadows. Near the altar, partially concealed behind a memorial tablet, was a small iron plate worked with the same three-leaf design that adorned the brass key Agnes had carried with such protective instinct. The craftsmanship was clearly from the same medieval hand that had created the lock on the crypt chest, suggesting a hiding place that had been prepared with considerable forethought. "The key, Agnes," Miss Marple said gently. "I believe your uncle ensured that you would possess not merely access to his evidence, but to his final words as well." The lock yielded with the smooth precision of mechanism that had been recently maintained, revealing a shallow recess containing a sealed envelope bearing Agnes's name in Silas Blackwood's careful handwriting. Inside, they found not merely legal documents, but a letter that carried with it the weight of genuine affection long suppressed by pride and circumstance. "My dear niece," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then my fears about Mrs. Larkin's intentions have proved justified, and I have failed in my duty to protect you from the consequences of my own poor judgment in trusting those who showed me only what I wished to see. I've been a difficult man, Agnes, made harsh by disappointment and suspicious by experience, but never doubt that my affection for you has remained constant even when my manner suggested otherwise." The letter continued with specific instructions for reclaiming her inheritance and detailed information about the evidence he had gathered against the criminal network. But it was the final paragraph that brought tears to Agnes's eyes. "I pray that you will find it in your heart to forgive an old man's failures and remember instead the uncle who taught you to identify wild flowers in the garden and who always believed you possessed the strength to build a life worthy of your generous spirit. The estate is yours by right, but more importantly, you have earned, through your courage, the freedom to use it as your conscience directs." Miss Marple observed Agnes's reaction with the satisfaction of seeing justice restored, not merely in legal terms, but in the deeper realm of human relationship and emotional healing. The young woman's tears carried with them not only grief for her uncle's death, but the relief of discovering that his apparent coldness had concealed genuine care. As they returned to the vicarage, where Inspector Slack awaited them with final reports about the broader investigation, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the particular tragedy of relationships poisoned by systematic deception. Mrs. Larkin's betrayal had corrupted not merely financial arrangements, but the basic human connections that made civilized life possible. The network extended across at least 8 counties, Inspector Slack reported with grim satisfaction. "We've identified 37 suspicious deaths over 7 years, each following the same pattern of trusted domestic staff, gaining access to private documents and vulnerable elderly residents dying under circumstances that appeared natural, but were actually murder." The scope of the conspiracy exceeded even Miss Marple's experienced imagination. Yet she recognized that its downfall had come through the same human weaknesses that had motivated it initially. Greed had led to overreach, pride had prevented proper caution, and the systematic nature of the crimes had created patterns that careful observation could eventually recognize and expose. As the morning progressed and Little Wickham began the slow process of healing from this violation of its peaceful order, Miss Marple prepared to return to St. Mary Mead with the quiet satisfaction of justice served and truth revealed. The mystery of the nun who had forgotten her own name had been solved through patient observation and the inexorable logic of human nature, proving once again that even the most sophisticated criminal conspiracy could not ultimately prevail against careful attention to the small details that revealed larger patterns of deception. Agnes walked with her to the village boundary, where the hired car waited to carry Miss Marple home. The young woman's bearing showed the transformation that comes from surviving systematic victimization and emerging with both identity and integrity intact. "What will you do now, my dear?" Miss Marple inquired as they reached the car. "Uncle Silas suggested in his letter that the estate might support a school for young women without family resources," Agnes replied with growing strength. I believe that would be a fitting memorial to his investigation and a practical way to protect others from the sort of systematic exploitation we've uncovered." Miss Marple nodded with approval, recognizing in Agnes's response the particular wisdom that comes from understanding how personal suffering can be transformed into protection for others. The conspiracy had sought to destroy not merely individuals, but the very foundations of trust that made communities possible. Yet its exposure would ultimately strengthen those foundations by revealing the methods through which they could be attacked. As the car pulled away from Little Wickham, Miss Marple gazed back at the ancient church of St. Bartholomew's, where the bells now rang with proper dignity rather than sinister signals. The summer fete that had begun with such innocent celebration had become the stage for revelations that reached into the darkest corners of human nature, but it had ended with the triumph of truth over even the most elaborate criminal artistry. The mystery had been solved through the careful application of those qualities of observation and deduction that served as humanity's best defense against the corruption of trust and the systematic exploitation of innocence. Human nature, as Miss Marple had long understood, contained within it both the capacity for extraordinary kindness and remarkable cruelty, often existing side by side in the same individual. The art of detection lay not in judging such contradictions, but in recognizing the patterns they created and using that recognition to protect the innocent from those who would exploit their vulnerability. As the peaceful countryside rolled past the car windows and the familiar landmarks of St. Mary Mead appeared in the distance, Miss Marple reflected that justice, like the patient growth of her garden, required both careful tending and the wisdom to recognize when intervention was necessary to prevent the corruption of what should flourish in safety. The nun who had forgotten her own name had remembered it in time to save not only herself, but countless others who might have fallen victim to the same systematic predation, and that, Miss Marple thought with quiet satisfaction, was perhaps the most fitting resolution of all.